Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to Seminar B of the Monique and Roland Weil People's Academy of International Law. I am Marjorie Cohn, Dean of the People's Academy and a member of the Bureau of the International Association of Democratic Lawyers. Our next program will be held on Thursday, April 11th. It will cover UN specialized agencies, including the Human Rights Council, UNRWA, the Refugee Agency, and UNESCO. That's April the 11th. Our topic for today's program is the illegality of unilateral coercive measures or sanctions. Our faculty for this seminar includes Nina Farnia, Prabhat Patnaik, Lucrecia Hernández, and Charlotte Cates. Each of them will speak for about 25 minutes. Then they will comment on each other's presentations, followed by Q&A with the registrants. We have French, English, and Spanish translation. Please put your questions in the Q&A box for our discussion following the program. In the next few days, we will post the faculty presentations in English, French, and Spanish on our website, peoplesacademy.net. Our first presenter is Nina Farnia. Nina is a legal historian and scholar of critical race theory, focusing on the role of modern imperialism in US law and politics. Her publications explore a variety of related subjects, including the formation of the national security state, the rise of autocratic legalism, US sanctions regime, and the evolution of the First Amendment. Her doctoral dissertation, Imperialism in the Making of US Law, 1940 to 2008, is the 2023 co-winner of the Julian Mezzi Dissertation Award from the Association for the Study of Law, Culture, and the Humanities, and it's the basis of her forthcoming book, Imperialism: An American Story. Nina has published in a wide range of academic journals and popular media outlets, such as the Stanford Law Review, UCLA Women's Law Journal, Middle East Critique, and Geopolitical Economy Report, among others. Nina will discuss the relationship between imperialism and sanctions, as well as hybrid warfare. Our next presenter is Prabhat Patnaik, who went to Oxford on a Rhodes Scholarship in 1966, where he obtained his Bachelor of Philosophy and Doctor of Philosophy degrees. He joined the Faculty of Economics and Politics of the University of Cambridge in 1969 and was elected a Fellow of Clare College in Cambridge. He returned to the newly established Center for Economic Studies and Planning of Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi in 1974. Prabhat retired from the Sukhomoy Chakravarti Chair of this center in 2010, and he's currently Professor Emeritus there. He has written a number of books and articles on macroeconomics, development economics, and political economy. Prabhat's books include Economics and Egalitarianism, Time, Inflation, and Growth, Whatever Happened to Imperialism and Other Essays, Accumulation and Stability Under Capitalism, The Retreat to Unfreedom, The Value of Money, Re-envisioning Socialism, A Theory of Imperialism, and Capitalism and Imperialism, which won the Baron Sweezy Prize. Between 2006 and 2011, he was vice chairman of the State Planning Board of the government of Kerala. Prabhat will discuss the contradiction between the global economic order and the imposition of sanctions. María Lucrecia Hernández is a lawyer. She is our next speaker. She is a lawyer from the University of Buenos Aires in Argentina. She has a master's degree in criminal law and criminal procedure from the University of Barcelona, Spain, and a master's in penal system and social problems from the Pompeu Fabra University in Barcelona. Lucrecia is a specialist in human rights and critical legal studies from the Latin American School of Policies. She is professor of the Master of Human Rights at the Bolivarian University of Venezuela and director of the social organization SURES, which is dedicated to the study and defense of human rights. Lucrecia is vice president of the Venezuelan Association of Jurists. She has published various books and articles related to human rights and security. Lucrecia will discuss unilateral coercive measures in the context of the United Nations and the extraterritorial application of the law, focusing on the case of Venezuela. Our final presenter is Charlotte Cates, who is the international coordinator of Samidoun Palestinian Prisoner Solidarity Network. She also coordinates the work of the National Lawyers Guild International Committee, and she served as a steering committee member and juror of the International People's Tribunal on US Imperialism, which was all about sanctions. She is a graduate of Rutgers School of Law and is based in Vancouver. Charlotte will discuss unilateral coercive measures and the siege on Gaza, as well as the denial of the right to self-determination, a counterforce to US-led unilateral coercive measures in the region. So Nina, would you like to begin?
Thank you very much to Charlotte and everybody that has been organizing this course. I'm actually excited to participate in it as a student myself later on. And thank you to everybody who's attending. So I am going to share my screen. Okay, does it look right? Can somebody give me a thumbs up? Or yes. Yeah, it looks good. Okay, great. Thank you. So this talk is entitled Sanctions and Racial Repression in US Imperialism. I'm going to sort of start big and define what imperialism is, how it relates to both how it executes itself through hybrid warfare and then specifically sanctions. And then I'm going to sort of present a case study that we learned about in the International People's Tribunal on US imperialism, and specifically the case study of North Korea, DPRK. So imperialism is a relationship of power requiring a subordinate peoples or nation that's subject to a ruling peoples or nation. Most of you, or many of you, I'm assuming, have read Lenin or Marx, and you've probably heard this. It requires foreign economic and political control over an otherwise sovereign nation, resource and wealth extraction, coupled with labor exploitation. And what's newer in the literature on imperialism is the idea of racial power, that imperialism requires ideological formations that produce racial power and justify its execution. In the case of the US, imperialism produces US foreign policy. So there's no real difference between imperialism and US foreign policy. Imperialism produces American foreign policy, and foreign policy is the way in which US imperialism is executed around the world. but it's not always executed through force. It's often executed through collaboration and various forms of dependence. So how historically has the US executed imperialism? Hybrid warfare is central to its strategy. And this is a paper, Future Warfare, The Rise of Hybrid Wars, is a paper that you can just Google online. It was written by Lieutenant General James Mattis and Lieutenant Colonel Frank Hoffman. James Mattis is Mad Dog Mattis. I'm sure some of you have heard of him. He's known to have been a particularly brutal general. So hybrid warfare is a fusion of both conventional and unconventional instruments of power and subversion, blended synchronously to exploit the vulnerabilities of the antagonist. The objective is to inflict optimal damage against the belligerent state, quote unquote, the belligerent state. What's interesting about hybrid warfare is that the line between war and peace is totally obscured. So it makes it hard to identify the war threshold. The United States right now is at war. If you define war as hybrid war, the United States now is at war with many nations throughout the world, across almost all of the continents. But because hybrid warfare makes war elusive, many people don't understand or view the US as being at war, which makes it difficult for the US public to rise up against US imperialism. The other characteristic or benefit of hybrid warfare to the empire, to the imperialist, is that it's marked by vagueness, complicating attribution, as well as response. What this means is that if you don't know, for example, who just destroyed your electrical grid, you don't know who you should retaliate against or how you should retaliate, right? And we know that the destruction of electrical grids has been a central component of hybrid warfare over the last couple of decades. So hybrid warfare basically is used in a variety of different ways. It involves economic manipulation through aid or dependency. It involves a ton of fake news, which we know, cyber attacks, military forces, both irregular and regular, migration issues, which is an issue specifically with regard to the US border in the South, electoral intervention, and diplomatic pressure as well, which is what we've seen in the UN Security Council for many, many years, but especially most recently. So in my research, as I try to define how US foreign policy executes imperialism, I've identified 4 policy pillars of US imperialism: militarism, economic coercive measures, which we colloquially call sanctions, foreign aid, and dollar diplomacy, which really is dollar dominance, or was dollar dominance. This is now changing. So the US has over 800 known military bases around the world. But that figure is likely much higher if we really think about how it collaborates with other nations and also unknown bases. In terms of sanctions, nearly 1/3 of the global population, mostly non-white, is subject to sanctions. And I'm going to talk specifically about sanctions in a minute. Foreign aid is a soft method for enforcing US policy interests in a type of quid pro quo relationship. And dollar diplomacy, or dollar dominance, until very recently, was executed through international trade, which was mostly conducted in the US dollar. And the dollar was the primary reserve currency throughout the world. It's still the case, but it's actually decreasing quite rapidly. A lot of nations have begun to carry their reserves in different currencies to diversify the currencies in which that they have their reserves in. And with the rise of BRICS, we're now, I think, going to see a rapid shift away from the dollar. The dollar is no longer as stable as it used to be. We all know that. So dollar dominance is on the decline. So in terms of militarism, as I just said, the US has over 800 known military bases around the world, coupled with an astronomical military budget that accounts for 40% of military expenditures worldwide. This is outrageous, especially if you think about the state of life for the people that are living here. The majority of the population is struggling to, almost half of the children in this nation are subject to food insecurity. The majority of the population is struggling to pay its bills, to maintain a decent lifestyle, to access education, to access healthcare. And this is one of the reasons why, this 40% figure. The Council on Foreign Relations, which is no radical council, it's a liberal, classically liberal think tank. Their global conflict tracker counts about 25 active conflicts throughout the world that involve the US. And between 1947 and 1989, the Washington Post reported that the US sought regime change at least 72 times around the world. And the majority of these operations, these coup attempts, were in non-white nations. Note that this number ends at 1989. It's likely much, much higher after 1989, during that period where we were living in a unipolar world. This is just an example of US imperialism in the Middle East, what we call the Middle East, West Asia. This is the series of interventions in that part of the world since 2001. And as you can see, it's trending toward proxy warfare, right? So providing support and funding for another nation state or another entity that executes US imperialism on behalf of the Americans. Whereas before, what we saw was direct warfare. But these are all losses, right? These were losses in the battlefield. They lost Iraq, they lost Afghanistan, they lost in Syria. And so they shifted toward proxy warfare. And still they're not able to really, quote unquote, win, but they are able to create the kind of chaos and destabilization that enables or supports or upholds US imperialism. The next policy pillar is foreign aid. And this is basically the promise of aid in exchange for something. An example, and usually that it's in exchange for military, often it's in exchange for military support. So, allowing the base and things like that. So a prominent example is the Food for Peace program, which requires compliance with US foreign policy interests and enforces a bias for US-based companies and investment. So for example, at one time, Food for Peace required that all food imports to aid nations come from the US, creating a market for US goods in perpetuity. Many of the borrower nations, again, are formerly colonized nations in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, mostly non-white. The next policy pillar of US imperialism is dollar diplomacy or dollar dominance. Until the current moment, most international trade was conducted in the dollar under the Bretton Woods system, and the reserve currency throughout the world was the dollar. But this is, again, as I said, in decline. An example is the petrodollar. In 1979, the US and Saudi Arabia made an agreement to maintain the price of Saudi oil exports exclusively in the dollar. In exchange, the US would defend the Saudi monarchy and provide them with arms. This particular relationship with Saudi Arabia is also not as strong as it used to be, as Saudi Arabia enhances its relationship with the BRICS nations. And then lastly, and most importantly for our purposes, economic coercive measures. So this is a map from the Sanctions Kill website of the nations that are currently subject to economic coercive measures. As you can see, it's an enormous landmass. And the majority of the nations are considered global South nations. And I guess for the exception of Russia, though I think Russia in many cases should be considered a global South nation. And mostly non-white. Yeah. So why sanctions? What is the advantage of sanctions? First, what are sanctions? So sanctions function to restrict trade, block financial transactions among nations, freeze assets, reduce or completely block foreign aid, and of course, travel bans. The goals of sanctions are sort of many. They give the US an economic advantage. They help to affect regime. They can help to affect regime change, so they haven't been super successful at this recently. And it's a form of retaliating against nations who exit the US sphere of influence, either through de-development or underdevelopment. By de-developing or underdeveloping these nations, they basically punish them. And as we know from the Sanctions Kill website and campaign, and also the Tribunal, the People's Tribunal on US Imperialism, sanctions kill. Really, they're genocidal. They devastate economies, and they impair or even block access to food, water, medicine, energy, and transportation. And it's massive. The impact, the scale of sanctions in a given nation is massive. The most acute example that we're witnessing right now, every day, is the example of Gaza, which is under blockade, and the Israelis are not allowing any aid. That's the most acute example, but it's actually not entirely distinct from many of the other nations throughout the world that are subject to sanctions and blockades. They've also experienced massive numbers of deaths, especially among children, as a result of a lack of access to medicine, food, and other necessities. So ultimately, and what we've learned through the People's Tribunal hearings, is that sanctions are theft. They're fundamentally a form of theft that is akin to the colonial, akin to what was happening during the colonial world order. The overwhelming majority of the sanctioned nations around the world are formerly colonized, non-white nations. So if you look at sanctions policy from a historical perspective, after the era of decolonization in most nations throughout the world, the Western powers in the US created a new way of stealing wealth and extracting resources. And this is it. This is it. It's a legal mechanism, unlike colonialism. The law enables it. Global international bodies, international legal bodies support it by and large. And it's devastated the world. So who is often the target of sanctions? It's often resource-rich nations, and a prominent example in this case is Iran, right? Iran is incredibly resource-rich and has the ability to support not only its own people, but many of the peoples throughout the world, if it were able to participate in the global economy fully. It's also geopolitical, strategic nations that are located strategically around the world, or geopolitically strategic in geopolitically strategic areas. So again, the region of the Middle East, what we call the Middle East, West Asia, the nations in that region are very, very well located in geopolitical terms. There are multiple bodies of water, multiple waterways that enable that are necessary to global trade, like the Red Sea, which is in the news a lot now. And at the intersection of multiple continents. And so it's no accident that those nations are also subject to US sanctions. Otherwise, they would be thriving. If it were not for the sanctions, these nations would be thriving because of their location, because of their history, and because of their resources. Another important component here is the history of socialism or independence. So nations that seek independence from the imperialist economic system through the nationalization of resources or other means are almost immediately subject to US sanctions, European sanctions, and even often UN sanctions. And there are many prominent examples. I'm going to talk about North Korea, DPRK, Venezuela. Lucrecia is going to talk about Venezuela, which is another prominent example. Iran is another prominent example. There are many, many examples. Zimbabwe is a significant example as well. Libya. And we covered a lot of these nations in the International People's Tribunal. It's notable that there actually is a relationship between sanctions and democracy. Sanctions destroy democracy. Whenever there's been a democratically elected government, in particular in my part of the world, in West Asia, the Middle East, the US has not allowed it to remain in power without hybrid warfare. And so there's a dialectical relationship between US imperialism and democracy. US imperialism undermines and destroys democracy. It does not uphold it, despite what we hear in the news and from government officials in the US. So now to the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. I'm going to give a brief history and then talk about sanctions. So, and much of this information is from Nodutol, the Nodutol presentation by Joo-hyun Park at the Sanctions Tribunal. And I'll give you the website at the end of my presentation so you can go and watch the videos if you like. They're all there. So imperial powers partitioned Korea in 1945 in an attempt to defeat communism. Here, this is the partition line here. And to connect this back to what I just said, the Korean Peninsula is an incredibly significant location from a geopolitical standpoint. It's a very strategic location because of its proximity to the islands and then also China and Asia. So the Korean War, contrary to popular belief, is not over. It's ongoing. This partition is maintained through an ongoing Korean War, and the US is a belligerent party. DPRK has basically been under sanctions for almost its entire existence. And 80% of DPRK trade is affected by sanctions. In 1995, there were massive floods on the peninsula. Now, the mainstream will tell you, and those of you that were alive or engaged then will know that there was a lot of talk of famine in North Korea. The mainstream discourse told us that the famine was self-induced. But in point of fact, over 80% of Korean arable land, so here's the peninsula, 80% of arable land is located in the south, which makes it much more difficult for the North to generate its own food. And because of the severe sanctions regime against the North, it makes it all the more difficult. Couple that with a natural disaster, with a climate disaster like the floods. So the 1995 floods swept away more than half of the infrastructure of the nation. 500,000 became homeless and 5.2 million people were affected. Food production fell by 2/3. Electrical generation capacity fell by 85%. Basically, floods destroyed decades of the Korean people's production since the partition. And for the second time, they had to rebuild their nation. So they did. This period was followed after the reports are that hundreds of thousands of people died in the late 90s and early 2000s. But this period was followed by massive achievements in health and agriculture. They became self-sufficient again. And by the 2010s, they were incredibly self-sufficient and very successful. So what did the US do? They escalated sanctions against DPRK. President Obama issued more sanctions against DPRK than any president since. And he did so. Obama was one of the smartest presidents we've had in recent history. He did so following the imposition of Security Council measures, creating the illusion that he was following an international agenda rather than setting an imperialist agenda by using the UN. Okay. And before I move on, so the reason I posted photos of children in North Korea is because actually children there, reports indicate that children there are some of the happiest children in the world because of economic equity and safety, public safety, and access to health and things like that. Children live quite freely. And those of us that have children know that children, like all of us, love freedom. And apparently there's a relationship between socialism and child freedom. So when it comes to the law, multilateral and unilateral coercive measures, they're both considered sanctions, right? Multilateral measures are executed through a variety of different nations and economic and international institutions, so like the UN, Security Council, and a bunch of different nations. Whereas unilateral coercive measures are measures that are executed by a single nation or entity. But this distinction, for the purposes of imperialism, is really not entirely correct. Multilateral and unilateral coercive measures are both imperialist in nature, and multilateral coercive measures utilize international law to execute US imperialism and uphold a Western world order. That, however, is now in rapid decline. And my hope is that other speakers will talk about the case study, the example of Russia. The sanctions against Russia after it invaded Ukraine were so severe that it was able to bypass them. And now sanctions are basically backfiring for Americans, especially sanctions against large nations, economically self-sufficient nations, and resource-rich nations. Which is why now we're seeing like all kinds of articles in academia about like the problems of sanctions. Before, sanctions were always considered a really peaceful and kind alternative to war. Now sanctions are all of a sudden a problem, not because they're genocidal, but because they're backfiring against the Americans and the Europeans. So I've given this presentation to my students before, and what I say to them is that a multipolar world order without a top cop that's devastating everybody is much, much better for all of us. And what we're seeing now is the rise of a multipolar world order with the rise of BRICS and alliances among global South nations. We're seeing something different than we've ever really seen before. And really, what this moment signifies is the fall of the European order. After over 500 years, we're now really beginning to see the fall of that world order, which was initially based on primitive accumulation through settler colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade. So it's despite how horrible this moment is, particularly as we watch the ongoing genocide in Gaza, this moment also has immense promise and potential. This is just some of the stuff that my talk was based on, in addition to Sanctions Kill and the Luto. I encourage you all to go to the website for the International People's Tribunal on US Imperialism. There you can watch the videos of all the hearings. We had about 15 country hearings or 17, including Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. And then here are some articles that you can also reference. Thank you all very much. I hope I did not go over it.
Thank you so much, Nina, for that great presentation and putting sanctions in the context of US imperialism and also providing a definition of unilateral coercive measures and multilateral coercive measures. We are going to move now to Lucrecia Hernández. So, Lucrecia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marjorie. Good morning, good afternoon to everyone. It's an honor for me to be in the seminary today and be able to talk with you some of the issue of unilateral coercive measures and how they have a direct impact on human rights and on the people. Particularly, I'm going to talk of what's been happening in the Venezuelan country. I'm the dean of the Popular International and the dean to invite me to participate and to say hello to all my Hispanic people and also all our audience today. We are going to be talk a little bit of approximation of a coercive measure and how they have been defined, the framework of international law and human right law, especially in the UN framework, the advances that we have had in this, and the different doctrines and legislations in the case of Venezuela, and also where some of the investigations and some of the reports and the honest, and then we end with an analysis and a review of this unilateral coercive measures in the case of Venezuela. The first thing to notice is that all of us have a way to analyze is the concept of unilateral sanctions. It's a pretty new concept in the framework of international law. It has been worked through all the resolutions that have been dictated by the Human Rights Convention and the Council of Human Rights of the United Nations, different resolutions by the General Assembly, and also some reports that the Special Rapporteur has produced of the impact of coercive measures in the human rights framework. And other international organizations that talk, although they might not be talking coercive measures, they talk about the impact of them. In the human rights in 2021, there was a resolution that I was to infer and to note with an issue of coercive measures, that unilateral coercive measures include economic measures and political, although they include a very wide spectrum of measures, and they're imposed by states or group of states to coaction other states to give up their sovereign rights and create a change in the direction of the political framework. And it's really important that we pay attention how they change the direction of the political of the state and of the government. So these measures are very damaging for the countries that are in the process of development because they increase the inequities in the states and they create bigger inequities internally in the state that are working on human rights issues. The Special Rapporteur considers some of the unilateral coercive measures, those measures that are not adopted by the Security Council, that is under the statutes of the United States, because those are the measures that are multilateral coercive under this framework. The statutes general, no state can apply this coercive measure whether economic or political, to force their own sovereign force and obtain any kind of advantage in any way. From the point of view internationally, the only measure that are coercive, that are legitimized on the international law, are those applied by the Security Council, and we have to discuss whether they're legal or fair under the framework of international human rights law, although they are in the statutes of the United States. Under the rapporteurs, we have making a distinction between what is coercive measure and those who are general, or those who are specific, those who are general, that are based on economics and the financial systems of the country, and they're indiscriminate, and they provide some kind of impacts on human rights of those who are most vulnerable, or the people that are the most poor in the country. The efficacy of those in terms of the changes in the political that happen in the sanction state, and when that state creates a lot of economic difficulty, that then make the publish to actually go against the political system. The second measure too, and those are selective or secondary, and they are actually where specific sectors of the economic sectors of the country, for example, of a production or different geographic areas, and the damage happened in that economic activity. And what happens is the loss of economic resources, and that has an impact, of course, in human rights. There can be general measures, or you can also have selective one, and the section state can actually apply both of them at the same time. We can also mention there's a big variety of coercive unilateral measure according to the area that they're trying to have an impact, whether it's commercial, military, or diplomatic. And there's of coercive measure that stimulate or generate, we can say, sudden change in the way that people move. And they can be also done against natural human common people or private people, industry or political people, or anybody that has a public function in the state. And how do you select the strategy and the intensity to it depends on the kind of resistance or the resilience of the state that has been impacted. The High Commissioner of the Human Rights in the United Nations, when we speak about human treaties and international law and human rights, they said there's some disposition that limit those unilateral coercive measures when they're impacting human rights of the civil population, and they're usually prohibited with the impact life or having fair living, housing, and the right for the people to be protected and hunger. From the General Assembly of the ONU since 1997, we have heard the declaration of the concern because of all the different recommendations. We can see this coercive measure still being used, and we continue to ask those states that continue to use them to abstain for using them. A very important process in the ONU, UN, it happens in 2016 when the United Nations Human Rights Council Commission talks about the negative impact of unilateral coercive measure in the spectrum of a human right. And from that mandate, there have been different reports to conceptualize those measures and also to talk, this group start making state visits and create reports on how those measures are impacting the human right in those countries.
Hasta ahora hubieron 3 redactores especiales. Hoy, en la actualidad, es una relatora de origen bielorruso y esta relatora
This relator has signaled, let's say, that there are different effects, specific, that come from that have to do with the capacity of the country that's being impacted. Also, it affects third-party countries that are not directly there, as we see controversies around this. Another point that also comes from the special rapporteur that's been signaled and that we have to pay special attention has to do with the extraterritoriality of this kind of imposition that comes from a specific state or a group of states that imposes this outside of their own territory and nation. These measures will violate the principles of applying these measures. The laws that are used to impose this can have an extra territorial impact, not so only on that country that this is being targeted towards, but also in third-party countries, and that they are going to force these third countries to also impose these unilateral measures on the country that is experiencing sanctions. And almost always, this threat of not following through with these sanctions will result in coercive measures also on these third countries. This last thing has been really developed by the doctrines of these relationships, and it's what is called the excessive compliance of over-compliance that practically creates the ending of commercial relationships between countries because of this risk, and it's going to create a de facto blockade on this country. In this part of I would like to also give concrete examples of how these coercive measures have affected in a real way specific states, and I would like to develop a little bit more of what it has to do with Venezuela. First, something that's very clear that we have to think about for Venezuela is that this blockade has a certain finality to be able to take advantage of the huge economic resources that the country has. And a little bit of what my last panelist comrade said, this is a stealing, a theft, as these measures continue to steal the economic resources, natural resources of countries. And this will also generate a change in the type of government that the majority of Venezuelans were electing through elections democratically for more than 24 years. Through this, one of the characteristics that we can see through the blockade is the immorality of this stealing of natural resources and also a illegal politics. In the case of Venezuela, it's going to be now this year 10 years of a formal blockade imposed by the United States and its allies, which began with the enactment of the Venezuelan Human Rights and Civil Society Defense Act on behalf of the US Congress in 2014, through which it's prohibited to have any kind of economic transaction with the Venezuelan government throughout the entire North America, and anybody that does not comply with these prohibitions will see consequences. Since 2014, a sanctioning route and systemic, deliberate, and generalized plan against the Venezuelan state and the people was aimed at preventing the development of the activities which the state depends on and that generates its wealth that has to do with petrol production. This petroleum production is a principal business of the state, which is called Petróleos Venezuela. And the sale of this generates approximately 95% of the income of foreign currency that the state needs to develop its social policies. And to understand the case of the impact on Venezuela of these unilateral coercive measures and the attack against the Venezuelan oil industry, it's important to know the measures that the Venezuelan state has been applying in relation to the oil issue to realize state control of this company and to have sovereignty of their resources. Since the 70s, oil exploitation in Venezuela was carried out directly by transnational corporations from England and North America and Dutch. In 1976, there was a nationalization of oil by the state-owned company. However, despite this nationalization, when the management of this oil company became a state run, the directors were still subordinate to the interests of the transnational corporations. In 2003, with the sanction, there was this brought about a big change in the policies, and big decisions were taken on behalf of this industry in terms of the destination of the exports. And from 2003, they were almost all to the United States. And since then, they started to shift towards the Caribbean, Central America, Argentina, Brazil, India, and China. And with this policy, Venezuela began to have a different policy that was more sovereign, aimed at integrating with global South countries and BRICS. The second decision that had to do with strengthening the petrol industry had to do with the organization with other exporting countries and in raising also prices internationally. OPEC, this company, was founded 60 years ago with Venezuela, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia, which in these 5 countries, 2 have been militarily invaded by the United States, and 2 more, like Venezuela and Iran, are now victims of a criminal blockade. So it's to say that every attack against this oil industry in Venezuela will necessarily have a human rights impact, because blocking of the sale of oil will generate a lowering of foreign income to be then inverted into social programs. And it's also important to take into account that all of the oil industry, all of the machinery that is developed in a commercial relationship with the United States, and all of the machine to refine and to produce these machines in Venezuela that are used by the industry in Venezuela, because it is a heavy industry that is bought in the United States. Aside from the blockade, that relationship is cut, and any renovation and maintenance of this industry is also going to be frozen. So we have to understand that in the last 20 years in the Venezuelan state, they have developed their entire social policy through what they can achieve with the sale of oil. And because of this, in 2000s, was recognized by UNESCO, FAO, UNICEF, and other UN agencies as a country free of famine and illiteracy and hunger. And this is a direct relationship with the functioning of the oil industry and the capacity of the state to guarantee their human rights. From this, like what we were talking about before, we can see that throughout these 10 years of the blockade and commercial blockade on Venezuela, that has fundamentally impacted and there's been a sanction on the public, private industries, every type of industry, a state industry, even for flight. There has generated an impact on the economic sector of the country that in which there is a dependence to be able to invest this into social development. In a more concrete way, we can visualize as one example, with application of these coercive measures, there was a abrupt drop in investment into the country, and this came with the sale of oil in 2003 to be able to generate 65,000 to to 3,800, and there was a loss of almost 130,000 million in these last years. And aside from this, there's a retention of money from Venezuela that was invested in foreign banks or taken into account in terms of the budget for food and medicine. That is now 7,000 million. And aside from this, more money that was invested in English banks and that now is not able to be accessed and returned to the country. To give a little bit more of a summary, and then we'll be closing. In 2009, there was a executive order that further blocked this oil industry with a finality to put control under a Venezuelan politician that lives outside of the country to be able to appropriate all of the benefits of this industry from the United States. And right now, the Financial Control Treasury Office limits the ability to liquidate and sell the activity of these businesses with the United States. It's called Cisco. And this produces more goods for the country. And to begin closing, from the economic standpoint, the amount of losses that are produced, and also from a human point of view, there's a huge effect in terms of the social indicators. For example, a study that was completed a couple of years ago from the Center for Economic and Policy Research in Washington gave statistical evidence that sanctions equates to a sentence, for example, an increase in mortality between 2013 and 2017. More than 40 million people have died as a result of lack of medical attention, because of the deterioration of the public resources of the state. And aside from this, there's also an increase in maternal mortality rate with the lack of imports as well. There is a case of before it was a receiving country of migrants to now being a country that exports migrants. And to be wrapping up, these coercive measures did not stop even during the 2020 pandemic, but increased and created more obstacles in being able to bring in vaccines and medicines to the country, even with the decisions that were made in the UN. So this is to signal how difficult, and it's really difficult to summarize just the economic impact that these measures have had. And we won't be able to calculate also the immense damage, physical, mental, that has been caused and that continues to happen with the Venezuelan people. But it's really important to also say that in reality, Venezuela has not needed humanitarian aid or other aid, but what really needs to be able to improve and develop economically and human rights is to lift these coercive measures and to respect the international rights, international human rights, and to end immediately, permanently these sanctions.
Muchas gracias, Lucrecia. Thank you so much for discussing the devastating impact that sanctions have on the Venezuelan oil industry, Venezuela's economy, and the Venezuelan society in general. Our next presenter is Prabhat Patnaik. Prabhat?
Thank you, Marjorie. It's a real pleasure and privilege to be asked to speak to this gathering. And I would like to generally express my appreciation that I have been invited to speak here. The imposition of unilateral coercive measures, or what one may call sanctions, by the United States and other advanced countries without the approval of the United Nations is something which has been likened by many to civilian bombing of the population. That essentially, like civilian bombing, it is in fact an indiscriminate punishment that is imposed on an entire population, which is for no fault of theirs. And obviously, this amounts to a war crime. As a matter of fact, the imposition of sanctions is even worse than a war crime for a number of reasons. Firstly, that civilian bombing is something which occurs in particular areas, while the imposition of sanctions affects the economy as a whole. You cannot escape the impact of sanctions by migrating somewhere else, as you can in the case of civilian bombing. Likewise, civilian bombing is necessarily of a duration which is the same as that of a war. When the war is over, civilian bombing is over. But sanctions can go on and on and on. As a matter of fact, we know that the sanctions against Cuba or against Iran have been going on for decades. Besides the loss of lives through the denial of food and medicines, in particular, to the entire population, is something which is not as visible as the impact of the civilian bombing, and therefore does not arouse in the international arena, at any rate, exactly the same kind of revulsion and anger which civilian bombing does. Therefore, in some sense, it is more, it has an appearance of being benign, which it is not. As a matter of fact, it is far more lethal in its overall impact. And it's particularly lethal to the population of the elderly, to women, to children, who are generally considered to be people who should be spared as much as possible the rigors of civilian bombing or the rigors of war. Therefore, in every conceivable way, not only are sanctions comparable to civilian bombing, but even worse, and certainly amount to a war crime. But what is more, even when you actually have some countries that are willing, for instance, to defy the sanctions and trade with the sanctioned country, you find that even so, the country cannot escape the impact of the sanctions for a number of reasons. Firstly, that even if there are intrepid, courageous sanction breakers, they can never fully make up for the supplies shortage of medicines, food, and so on, so that some degree of inflation continues to occur. What is more, inflation is also enabled because of the fact that there is invariably a problem of exchange rate shortage giving rise to the depreciation of the country's exchange rate, the sanctioned country's exchange rate. This happens for a variety of reasons. Obviously, your exports cannot be large enough as they used to be. It is also the case that your inward flow of remittances tends to dry up. And what is more, even the reserves that you have, which are normally held with some kind of banks, are frozen by the countries imposing the sanctions. So the sanctioned country usually has a foreign exchange shortage, and this in turn implies a depreciation of its exchange rate, which means that imported goods also tend to be much more expensive in terms of the domestic currency. Therefore, even if the sanctioned country somehow manages to get hold of some supplies of the commodities in shortage, like food, medicines, and so on, they invariably come at a much higher price than would have been the case otherwise, and therefore the population at large is really starved of these essential commodities, because of which there is a heavy toll that sanctions take on this population. Therefore, in many ways, one would have to say that even though sanctions are comparable to civilian bombing and a war crime, they are actually, in a sense, much worse because they give the appearance of being far more benign. But I want to discuss a different aspect of the sanctions, which is normally not all that discussed. And that is to do with the fact that sanctions go against the rules of the international economic order. For instance, we now live under a current international economic order in which there is generally a free flow of goods and services and of capital, including finance, across country borders. The free flow of goods and services is something which is supervised by the World Trade Organization. And of course, the free flow of capital and finance is something which is supervised by the institutions like the IMF and the World Bank and so on. Now, the argument which is provided for such an international economic order is that it is beneficial for all. That basically, if you have relatively unrestricted flow of goods and services across country borders, then given the resources at your command, the bundle of goods and services you'd get hold of through trade would be larger than the bundle of goods and services you could simply domestically produce. Now, that being the case, you would be much better off. And so would the other countries be. So every country, it is argued, would be better off if you have free flow of goods and services and, of course, of capital, including finance, across the country borders. Now, suppose we accept this argument. In that case, sanctions amount to an infringement of this free flow of goods and services and of capital, including finance. Therefore, the very organizations which are supposed to be the monitors of the international economic order, the WTO, the World Bank, the IMF, they should be condemning sanctions on the grounds that it is really decreasing the welfare of the world's population, not just the population of the sanctioned country, but by their reasoning, the population even of the sanctioning countries. Therefore, they should be opposing the imposition of sanctions on welfare theoretic grounds, but you never find them saying a word against the imposition of sanctions. In other words, there is a kind of duplicity that they engage in. They loudly proclaim the benefits of free trade, the benefits of free capital inflows, or free capital flows, but they never once condemn the infringement of this free flows of goods and services and capital and finance, which is a result of the imposition of unilateral sanctions. The kind of duplicity that they engage in. I'll give you examples of the way that this duplicity works. For instance, we are told that countries of the global south should not really attempt to be self-sufficient in food grain production. In fact, the WTO has a rule, which is an amazing rule, whereby any support by the government, by the domestic government of the global south country, which provides a price to the farmers that is 10% more than the price that would have obtained if the 1986 global price and the 1986 exchange rate of the country in question had prevailed. Now, obviously, since 1986, much water has flown down the river, and as a result, prices, even global prices, have increased. Exchange rates have depreciated secularly for much of the global south, and therefore, to say that not more than 10% should be the supported price is the fact that it's deliberately an attempt to prevent government support for local agriculture, in particular local food grain production. Therefore, the whole argument is to wind up the public distribution system that prevails in many countries and to stop providing or stop producing your own food grains, but rather to import it. Now, this is something which has been drilled into the ears of the global south by the WTO for a very long time. But not being self-reliant in food grain production is what makes countries of the global south extremely vulnerable to these sanctions because as everybody knows, food and medicines are the two commodities in whose case the bite of the sanctions is really most lethal. Therefore, on the one hand, you say that you give up producing food grains, that you become dependent on food grains, but at the same time, this is something that makes you vulnerable to unilateral coercive measures, which these organizations that reach the virtues of giving up food grain production in the global south never condemn. And this is acute duplicity. Let me give you another example that, for instance, there are multinational banks. Now, the rules of banking state that the depositor can withdraw. Subject to banking regulations, the depositor can withdraw whatever he or she has deposited with the bank. So the freedom to withdraw whatever you have deposited at your will, subject, of course, to whatever limits the banking system may be placing for economic reasons, is something which is taken for granted. People deposit in banks precisely because they are confident that they can withdraw the money whenever they need. Now, imagine, however, it is for this reason that many countries of the global south, whether it is Iran, whether it is Venezuela, many countries actually deposit their foreign exchange reserves with multinational banks. But on the other hand, you find that suddenly the imposition of sanctions actually freezes the deposits which they have of their foreign exchange reserves with the multinational banks. Now, this freezing of the foreign exchange reserves, therefore, is a violation of the ordinary rules of banking on the basis of which countries had deposited their reserves with the multinational banks. It really amounts, therefore, to an act of international brigandage, because effectively you get someone to deposit money on a certain kind of understanding, but on the other hand, you simply freeze the money which you like when you like, and therefore it's an act of no less than an international brigandage. This is what had happened to Iran very early. This has happened recently to Russia, and this is something which has happened to Venezuela and other countries. And therefore, you find that the imposition of sanctions is a violation of the rules of the international order, the rules on the basis of which the international order is supposed to function, and organizations are forever pressing countries of the global south to follow these rules, to in fact have confidence in the international order that the sanctions violate. But of course, this duplicity on the part of the international organizations is something which is not just of the international organizations. The duplicity is of the advanced capitalist countries themselves. As a matter of fact, these international organizations are there only to promote the interests of the advanced capitalist countries. I gave you two examples, and let me now look at the same example from a different angle. The reason why the global south is asked to give up food grain production is not because of the fact that they would have access to a larger bundle of food grains and this and that, but because of the fact that the global north has a surplus of food grains which they want to sell to the global south. And therefore, in order to get rid of their surplus stocks, they want the global south not to be food self-reliant. Similarly, when it comes to attracting foreign exchange reserves and attracting deposits from the global south, obviously the financial institutions that do so are financial institutions belonging to the global north. That typically US financial institutions, multinational banks belonging to Europe or America are the ones with whom these foreign exchange reserves are deposited. Therefore, they want to enlarge the business of their finance capital, and they want to get rid of their surplus stocks. Therefore, the whole argument that is presented as if free trade is good for all, or a free capital movement is good for all, is an argument which is actually a vacuous one. As a matter of fact, colonial deindustrialization, when imports of goods came from the global north, from the industrializing countries that demolished the local craft production in over much of the global south, pushing the craftsmen into unemployment and swelling the labor reserves, that is something which clearly shows that free trade, far from being beneficial for all, actually gives rise to mass unemployment in countries of the global south. As a matter of fact, something of that kind is happening under the current international economic order. That basically what you have is that farmers are not supported by the government the way they used to be, which then implies that they are no longer viable, their costs of production go up because the kind of subsidies they used to get are no longer available to them. Again, there's a kind of duplicity in this, because subsidies which are given, let us say, to farmers in the advanced countries, who are very few and far between, are direct subsidies, and that is supposed to be all right under the rules of the WTO. But subsidies through price movements, through supporting a higher price than they would otherwise have got, or ensuring that inputs are available at lower prices, are subsidies which are supposed to be unacceptable under the WTO. So there's kind of duplicity there. But anyway, the withdrawal of government support from peasant agriculture makes many peasants destitute. They swell the labor reserves, and employment does not increase at the same rate because of more rapid technological progress that gets introduced. Because now there's greater competition between countries. They can't protect one another. They can't protect no country can protect its industries, and therefore there is a more rapid rate of technological change. Therefore, employment does not increase as rapidly, and so you have labor reserve swelling, but on the other hand, employment does not increase. So there is greater poverty, greater income inequality within the countries of the global south. While a few people do well, the bulk of the working population suffers and languishes. But on the other hand, this happens precisely under pressure from the advanced capitalist countries. But the same countries also turn around and impose sanctions on any of these countries of the global south if they feel dissatisfied with the foreign policy it is pursuing, if they feel dissatisfied with whatever policies it is pursuing. Therefore, the duplicity is one which afflicts not only the international economic institutions, but the duplicity springs from the advanced countries themselves, of whom the international economic institutions are basically, whose interests are being articulated by these international economic institutions. However, there is one silver lining in this, which it seems to me arises precisely because, you see, this attempt at total dominance, having the global south pursue policies which are acceptable and favorable to you, but on the other hand, also having the option to impose sanctions when you like against any country of the global south, this whole business of having your cake and eating it too, which is what the global north has been pursuing and the advanced capitalist countries have been pursuing, is really reflective of a desire for total control. But this desire for total control, as I mentioned, is something which is now likely to be generating a certain amount of resistance. And that resistance comes about in the following way. You can sanction one country. You can impose sanctions on one or two or half a dozen countries. But if you impose sanctions on dozens of countries, in that case, those countries would tend to get together. As a matter of fact, one of the remarkable things is that the sanctions which have been imposed against Russia, against the import of Russian natural gas into Europe. Now, the sanction is being broken because the Russian natural gas is now being imported into Europe via countries like India. So the gas comes to India, then India is exported to Europe. So the sanctions are being broken. Therefore, and likewise, you have a situation where if countries cannot get dollars because of the sanctions and therefore cannot buy in the international market, then if there are many such countries, they would tend to get together to form their own trade arrangements. As a matter of fact, therefore, you now have a situation where bilateral trade agreements are beginning to emerge within the global south among countries which have been sanctioned, or among countries which are sanctioned together with countries not sanctioned. You therefore have a way in which the hegemony of the dollar is going to be increasingly undermined if more countries pursue this kind of bilateral arrangement. Therefore, sanctions which are really incredibly damaging to the economies of the sanctioned countries, to the economies of the global south, are really creating a situation where, out of their own desperation, these countries are beginning to innovate new arrangements which, in fact, attempt to shake off the hegemony of the advanced capitalist countries, the hegemony of imperialism, and the hegemony of the dollar. And in the future, since the shaking of this hegemony is a precondition for any kind of development, any genuine development in the global south, this is the beginning of a new trend which is altogether welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Prabhat, for explaining how sanctions are even more devastating than civilian bombing, the duplicity, and how sanctions exacerbate inflation, promote dependency, and impact the economic world order, but still giving us some hope because the sanctioned countries are banding together and concluding these treaties. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Our next presenter is Charlotte Cates. Charlotte?
Thank you so much, Marjorie, and thank you so much to everybody. It's an honor to be here with all of you today and to continue to work together following the International People's Tribunal on US Imperialism to continue to build a movement on the educational, political, and legal level to struggle against sanctions, blockades, and coercive economic measures. I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to be focusing today on the siege on Gaza and how this fits into the framework of economic coercive measures and imperialism that we've been discussing so far today. And the attention of many people around the world has been drawn to the horrific situation in Gaza right now because of the bombing. And I think this is one of the things that really just stood out in Prabhat's presentation is the discussion of the effects of coercive economic measures and of bombing targeting civilians and how these two things can be comparative and also cumulative. And so when we're looking at the situation in Gaza now, and we see the tens of thousands of people who have been slaughtered, when we see the dropping of bombs, the sending of missiles against civilians, the mass displacement of over 2 million people, we can look at the situation and correctly identify it as a genocide that is taking place right now as we speak and as we have this meeting. But the fact is that the siege on Gaza has always been a genocide. And the siege on Gaza has always been a mechanism to carry out genocide, one that is carried out not only by the Zionist occupation, the so-called State of Israel, but also by all of its imperialist power backers, particularly the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, Germany, France, and other members of the European Union. And before we speak specifically about the siege, I know we have a limited amount of time, so I'm not going to speak extensively about Palestinian history. But the fact is that Gaza has always been a center of Palestinian resistance to occupation and colonialism. In addition to the fact that Gaza has been a center of population, of trade, of learning for over 1,000 years, for well over 1,000 years. And then, in fact, some of the buildings that have been targeted for destruction and cultural institutions that have been targeted for destruction in the ongoing bombing genocide that is being carried out by the Zionist regime right now have been targeting that cultural history and ongoing legacy. But since the colonization of Palestine, Gaza has been a center of resistance. And it's important to note that today's population in Gaza is over 70% Palestinian refugees. These are Palestinian refugees who were either expelled themselves from occupied Palestine 1948 during the 1947-48 Nakba, in which Zionist militias seized control of over 78% of historic Palestine and forcibly displaced the Palestinians living there. 70% of the Palestinian population was displaced, and today 70% of Palestinians in Gaza are Palestinian refugees who have been, for the past 75 to 76 years, denied their right to return to their homes and lands within Palestine, a right that has never been extinguished during that time. And the Nakba was not only a colonization of Palestine, it was quite blatantly an act of genocide. It was quite blatantly the colonial theft of Palestinian land and the forced displacement, murder, and destruction of the Palestinian people, the attempted destruction of the Palestinian people in order to create the Zionist state on the land of occupied Palestine, to supplant the British colonial mandate over Palestine, not with Palestinian sovereignty and self-determination, but instead with a colonial occupation regime. It was in 1967 that Gaza became fully occupied by the Zionist regime and once again immediately became a site of resistance. In fact, the resistance leadership in Gaza in the late 1960s and early 1970s were part of the Palestinian left, led by the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. And one of the leaders was Mohammed al-Aswad, who was known as Javara Gaza or Guevara Gaza, named after Che Guevara. And Israeli occupation leaders used to say that they controlled the Gaza Strip during the day, but it was Guevara Gaza who controlled the Strip at night. And so it was always the case that Gaza has been a center of popular resistance, armed resistance, and all forms of ongoing, cultural, political, and in fact, economic resistance to the Zionist occupation of Palestine. It was, in fact, in Gaza where the Great Popular Intifada of 1987 erupted for the first time, and it was the running over of a Palestinian worker in Gaza by an occupation military vehicle that launched that intifada, which drew the world's attention once again to the struggle of the Palestinian people for liberation. Throughout the 2000s in the Al-Aqsa Intifada, we continued to see Gaza as a center of resistance. And of course, that has been reflected in the ongoing assaults, genocides, wars, and siege arrayed against Gaza for the past 15 years in particular, 17 years in particular. And so, of course, then it comes as no surprise that Gaza was from where the Al-Aqsa flood was launched on the 7th of October, 2023, and where we have seen this ongoing massive criminal genocide that is being carried out on a daily basis by the Zionist regime, targeting every aspect of civilian life: residential buildings, homes, schools, mosques, and hospitals and church. As we are speaking now, Al-Shifa Hospital is under severe attack. Yes, this is the second time. We might have been having this conversation 3 months ago, but we're having it again now because this assault has not stopped throughout that time. And of course, this is not an assault that is being carried out by the Zionist regime alone, but is being funded and armed by the United States and its partners. And of course, as we speak about Gaza and the siege on Gaza, it's also further important for us to note that the Palestinian people as a whole are living under a state of siege. In Gaza, this is very apparent, but it is also true in the West Bank, where every aspect of Palestinian life is subject to occupation, to military control, to domination, to apartheid and segregation, and to a bevy of war crimes and crimes against humanity. In occupied Jerusalem, where Palestinian existence is constantly under attack, where where homes and Palestinian homes are being destroyed and Palestinian families are being displaced in order to carry out and continue this process of ethnic cleansing and of genocide that we've been speaking about since 1947 to 1948 in occupied Palestine 48, where there are dozens upon dozens of discriminatory and racist laws that fundamentally define the state as being not for its citizens who are Palestinian and Arab, Palestinians in the refugee camps who have been denied their right to return home for 75 to 76 years, and everywhere in exile and diaspora. That siege is a state applied to the entire Palestinian people, and sanctions are a state applied to the entire Palestinian people, with Gaza at the center.
Charlotte, for the interpreters.
Thank you so much. When we speak about the Gaza siege, it's important to talk about the impact before the 7th of October, 2023, and not only the impact that has come since. 81.5% of people in Gaza live below the poverty line. 71% of those, much like in the population as a whole, are Palestinian refugees denied their right to return home. 64% of the population were food insecure before October 7th. I mean, as we all know, we are now seeing the construction of a human-made famine in Gaza, but that's building on a situation where 64% of the population were already suffering from human-made food insecurity due to the siege on Gaza. In 2021, the unemployment rate in Gaza was 47%, with youth unemployment at 64%. And it's not quite clear in these statistics, but the traditional industries of Palestinians in Gaza, for example, farming and fishing, have been particularly targeted for military assault as well as economic coercive measures in an attempt to destroy and smother these independent national industries, which have always been capable of feeding the Palestinian population of Gaza self-sufficiently without external interference. As you can see, in 2020, the per capita GDP was $1,049 US, 4 times lower than in the West Bank or in Jordan. And 80% of the population received some form of humanitarian assistance, including 1.1 million officially registered Palestinian refugees receiving food aid from UNRWA, the UN Relief Works Agency. Palestinians in Gaza also suffered from severe effects on water. Only 3.8% of water wells in Gaza before October 7th, 2023 met the health standards of the World Health Organization. 1/4 of illnesses in Gaza were waterborne. 43% of the domestic water supply was not able to reach households due to damage to the infrastructure of the water system due to ongoing Israeli bombings, as well as the siege directly, because Palestinians were denied the ability to import materials and equipment to fix the water system because all of this was labeled by the occupation as dual use, which meant that they were able to deny entry. Palestinian patients needed to seek exit permits in order to request medical care, and 33% of those were delayed or denied. And it's also important to note that on various occasions, Palestinians seeking medical care outside Gaza were subjected to demands to become collaborators, to inform on their families and communities, or were taken prisoner when they attempted to cross. And this happened on multiple occasions. And there are currently Palestinian prisoners in Zionist jails who were captured in this way. And this is just an image that was created by Visualizing Palestine. Once again, this image dates from 2022. It was prior to October 7th. So when we see the level of devastation that has been visited on Gaza, this is not something that has just happened. This is an ongoing situation. And we can see the roots and ongoing genocide that did not start on October 7th, but has in fact been happening for over 76 years. And it's also important to note in this context that the siege on Gaza is part and parcel of the overall genocide targeting Palestine and the Palestinian people. But it is also a regime change program. Because the fact is that despite these conditions, these extreme conditions of targeting, of abuse, of colonization, of genocide, that Palestinians in Gaza have continued to develop ways to build their self-sufficiency, build their resistance, build their economic resiliency, and build their infrastructure despite a massive bombing attack every few years. I mean, when we held the hearing for the International People's Tribunal on US imperialism on Gaza in May of 2023, our speakers came to us to share their stories amid ongoing Israeli bombing. One of our speakers, who had already lost his family members who were taken from him by a previous Zionist bombing raid, had to leave halfway through the session because an alert had come that the bombing was coming to the building where he was staying. This became an ongoing and regular experience of Palestinians in Gaza. Now, the Zionist occupation will often claim, and continues to claim, that in 2005, it withdrew from Gaza or engaged in what it called a redeployment of forces. And what that essentially meant in practice was that the Palestinian resistance in Gaza had grown so strong that the occupation was no longer able to hold the land of Gaza or provide safety or security for the illegal colonial settlers and settlements that it had planted there. The 2005 withdrawal was not a gift given by the Zionist regime to the Palestinian people. Instead, it was a reality that the Palestinian resistance in Gaza was now strong enough to repel the occupation on the ground and make it impossible to continue to sustain the daily untouchable life of colonial occupation, which the Zionist regime wants to maintain as its standard. This is the context in which in 2006, the Palestinian Authority held elections. And these PA elections were the ones that were participated in for the first time by resistance forces, including Hamas, the Islamic Resistance Movement, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and others. And this was a political debate at the time about whether it was a good idea to participate in these elections. But the fact is that the candidates that were supported by the Hamas movement won those elections quite clearly, and that quite dramatically, and this was a result that was largely unexpected by the imperialist powers, who had been demanding that the PA must hold elections for several years. Well, immediately after the election results were announced, the next day and the next hours were a set of sanctions, not only once again by the Israeli occupation, but by the US, the EU, the UK, and Canada, because Palestinians had voted in a way that was unacceptable to them. And so what we saw was not only a massive ramp up in economic cuts to aid, various forms of pressure, but also very much funding and supporting mechanisms that would bring about internal Palestinian division and support Palestinian forces that were willing to be complicit and compliant with the Zionist domination of Palestine and the Palestinian Authority in order to undo the results of these elections and keep the so-called security coordination that the Palestinian Authority provides to the Israeli occupation in place. And unfortunately, in the West Bank, that process was able to happen. But in Gaza, it wasn't. And in 2007, when these forces attempted to destroy the democratically elected leadership of the Palestinian government in Gaza, they were defeated quite clearly. And after that defeat happened, we saw the massive imposition of the current siege that we see today. Gaza has a direct border with Egypt. There is no reason why the border between Egypt and Gaza should be moderated by European officials, Israeli officials, or anyone else, except for the fact that the current Egyptian regime has essentially been constructed since the Camp David Agreement, since it's with its dependency on US support as a state, as a proxy state for the United States that is essentially bound to carry out its will. And so the Rafah crossing was managed by European Union monitors, and those European monitors pulled out right away. So it was in fact the European Union that took the very first steps to imposing the siege on Gaza that we see today. And so one of the major purposes has been like serving these dual purposes of both trying to ethnically cleanse Palestine in order to complete the Zionist project, but also to carry out a process of regime change. Because despite the fact that the seas of Gaza were filled with occupation warships and the skies were filled with drones and warplanes, the land of Gaza, and as we've seen through the struggle of the resistance, under the land of Gaza was fundamentally land that was in the process of liberation and had been claimed as liberated territory, essentially as a liberated base on the land of occupied Palestine by the Palestinian people and their resistance. Not through a process of so-called negotiations with the occupier, not by receiving US aid and support, but through the power of the Palestinian resistance and their regional allies and supporters. And this was something that was unacceptable, not only to the Zionist project, but to all the imperialist powers that continue to empower it, arm it, and fund it. And so much like we see in Cuba, in Venezuela, in the DPRK, in Iran, the siege on Gaza has been a regime change siege for the past 17 years. Palestinians have been denied self-determination and sovereignty to the extent of full-on economic warfare and physical warfare and genocide, as we see right now, for choosing a future for themselves that is one of self-determination rather than one of submission. And so this is the economic and political context that has led up to the era of the Al-Aqsa flood that we are experiencing today. And so when we talk about the statistics, and I just want to pay a little bit of attention to this, the statistics of the current Israeli genocide in Gaza. These are approximate numbers because we don't know all of the detailed numbers, but if anything, these numbers are conservative rather than extreme. Over 40,000 Palestinians have been killed. Over 35,000 have been recorded, and it is very reasonably presumed that there are thousands more dead under the rubble. Over 74,000 have been injured. 134 journalists have been killed. 2 million Palestinians have been displaced. 112,000 homes are completely destroyed, and 256,000 partially destroyed. 438 schools are destroyed. 2,131 industrial facilities are destroyed, just to underline that this is an economic war as well as it is an all-encompassing genocide on all levels, including the economic levels. 771 health workers have been killed. 285 healthcare facilities have been occupied and destroyed. And that's just a small number. And of course, there are over 3,000 Palestinians who have been detained, who have been forcibly disappeared. Once again, in a Shifa hospital, we are seeing the mass detention of health workers and doctors. We've been seeing for years the denial, for example, of medical imaging devices have been denied access to Gaza. Palestinians have built a healthcare system that has been capable of tracking people, of treating people in the worst form of conditions after under siege and under bombing raids and destruction targeting the healthcare project in Gaza very specifically. And what we are seeing now is an attempt fundamentally to destroy that, to wipe that off of the map. It's building on the denial of medical imaging devices, the denial of medicines into Gaza. This has been going on for decades. And now what we're seeing is the bombing of the hospitals. And once again, this is one of the mechanisms of genocide, is by targeting the healthcare industry and the health workers that are able to resist that genocide. The US, when it speaks, claims to want humanitarian aid to reach Gaza. In fact, when they speak about humanitarian aid to Gaza, they speak about it as if there is a tornado or an earthquake that has taken place, even though these kinds of disasters are not necessarily natural in this period of imperialist-made climate change. What we are witnessing is a Zionist genocide being carried out in Gaza that's being armed and funded by the United States and its allies. It's not an abstract act that's kind of happening due to a natural disaster. The US has insisted on the closing of the Rafah crossing since 2006. If the US wanted to send trucks of aid into Gaza, it would simply call up the Egyptian government and say, we want our trucks to go through. And so this is why we're seeing this theater of the US airdrops rather than any mechanism to actually bring aid into Gaza, because this is fundamentally insisting on siege in an attempt to coerce the Palestinian resistance into surrender, which it has refused to do, and to insist on siege as a condition of any ceasefire. That is that all of the industry, the economy, and the well-being of people in Gaza will be subject to Israel and the United States' decisions about Palestinian leadership and Palestinian features. And I just want to note in particular, there's been a targeting, especially in the past 3 days, of aid providers in an attempt to force a defeat upon a victorious and resisting Palestinian people. Because the fact is that despite the horrendous civilian toll that the occupation has imposed upon the Palestinian people, it has failed to achieve its military goals of destroying the Palestinian resistance. It has been completely unable to do so. The resistance is deeply rooted, and throughout the region, there is perhaps a stronger regional resistance bloc than there has been at any time in recent history. And so this is an attempt to impose defeat upon a people that, despite the tremendous civilian toll and the ongoing genocide, have not been defeated and are instead moving towards victory. These are 6 Palestinians: Faik al-Mabhou, Raed al-Banna, Mohammed al-Bayoumi, Amjad Hathat, Ismail al-Nunu, and Jamal Khashoggi. These have all been assassinated by the Zionist regime in the past 3 days. The first 3 are Gaza police, who were specifically in charge of and led the project to successfully bring aid to the north of Gaza. And for the first time since this genocide began, they were able to bring aid successfully, and they were assassinated for it. Amjad Hathat was chair of the committee in Gaza City to distribute aid, while Ismail Nunu and Jamal Khashoggi were leaders of tribes, traditional family tribes in Gaza, who had been approached by the occupation to be an alternative conduit for aid to the resistance, refused to do that, and instead worked together with the Gaza police and the resistance to distribute the aid effectively and returned some semblance of normal life to northern Gaza. And this is why all 6 of these men have been assassinated, along with, in many cases, their wives and their children in just the past 3 days. When we speak about unilateral coercive measures, it's important to also talk about how they target the right to resist. There is a lot of international law that underlines Palestinians' right to resist, including multiple UN General Assembly resolutions and declarations. Probably most famous is UNGA Resolution 3743, which specifically affirms the legitimacy of the struggle for independence, territorial integrity, national unity, and liberation from foreign domination and occupation by all available means, including armed struggle. The resolution openly recognizes the right to use force against foreign illegal occupation, which it considered a serious threat to international peace and security, specifically noting the cases of Namibia and Palestine. This is also inherent in the Geneva Conventions, particularly the additional protocol that classifies these struggles in which people are fighting foreign occupation and racist regimes as legitimate armed conflicts in which those who are captured are legitimate prisoners of war. And what this means is that third states are under the obligation to recognize the legitimacy of the Palestinian people's resistance. The discourse that we have in the United States, in Canada, in the Western imperialist powers about Palestinian resistance and Israeli colonialism is completely upside down. Israel does not have a right to self-defense against the people it is illegally occupying and colonizing. The occupation regime is under the obligation to refrain from persecuting Palestinians for legitimate resistance. Furthermore, it is under the obligation to provide care for and end its occupation, not to carry out genocide against those whom it is occupying. This is relevant not only to the Palestinian struggle inside occupied Palestine, but to the regional resistance forces that have also been targeted for defending their national sovereignty and for defending their national sovereignty from imperialism and for playing a proper role in supporting and recognizing the legitimacy of the Palestinian people's resistance and upholding their obligations under international law to prevent the crime of genocide, particularly as we see in the case of Yemen, in Iran, in Lebanon, and in Syria. Resistance is not terrorism. And this is a note in relation to how we conceive of unilateral coercive measures. Obviously, we're speaking about the kinds of sanctions that we see levied on Venezuela, on Cuba, on Zimbabwe, on the DPRK. Obviously, we're talking about the siege on Gaza. But the fact is that the so-called counter-terror laws that we see within the United States, Canada, the European Union, the UK, Australia, are also a form of unilateral coercive measures. Palestinian resistance is targeted as terrorism, and Palestinian resistance organizations, which once again have the right to resist occupation and oppression and a right to engage in armed struggle in order to seek the liberation of their people from the crime of colonialism, genocide, and illegal occupation and apartheid, are being listed as so-called terrorist organizations. What this does is create not only a regime of criminal prosecution, but also of financial control, part and parcel of the sanctions regime. And so we see unilateral coercive measures, as we mentioned, on Iran, on Lebanon, on Syria, on Yemen, to disrupt the regional resistance, as well as the listing of Hamas, Hezbollah, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the Islamic Jihad movement, the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades, and multiple other Palestinian resistance organizations as terrorist organizations, which means not only that they cannot access funds, but that people can be arrested and criminalized and sent to jail for providing material support, in many cases, which is characterized specifically as charitable aid that has nothing to do with armed struggle, but that is considered to enable these organizations to engage in armed struggle if charitable needs are already taken care of. That's not the real reason, but that's the specific legal argument that's been advanced by the United States. These domestic cases, like the Holy Land Foundation 5 in the United States, there are 3 Palestinian men still in jail, 2 of them serving 65-year sentences simply for providing charitable aid to Palestinians, Ghassan al-Ashi, Shukri Abu Bakr, and Mufid Abdul Qadir, Amin Abu Rashid in the Netherlands, the Irfan Association in Canada that was designated as a terrorist entity. These cases are about the Palestinian people and their legitimate right of resistance, but these cases that were targeted, they're just charitable funds. But what they are unencumbered, unrestricted aid that are based on aid to the Palestinian people, not a mechanism of control that allows for imperialist domination of Palestinian politics and Palestinian futures. And so what we're seeing here is essentially the internationalization of the siege on Gaza and also its expansion. So it's not only against these resistance organizations, but to popular movements and organizations in Palestine and around the world. We've all seen the number of everything from Instagram accounts to Meta accounts to bank accounts that have been shut down for organizations raising money for Palestine. We've seen the labeling of major NGOs in Palestine as terrorist organizations. Euromed Human Rights Monitor, which provides some of the most reliable monitoring information from Gaza, was designated a terrorist organization by Israel in 2015 after its documentation of the 2014 assault on Gaza. Samidoun, which I represent, was declared a terrorist organization by Israel in 2021 because of our advocacy for the liberation of Palestinian prisoners. And that has had a real effect in terms of not being able to process credit card donations, not being able to open bank accounts, an ongoing form of economic siege that is largely unseen and that is being experienced by Palestinian communities and diaspora and solidarity organizations in all of the imperialist countries. This is an imposition of siege and unilateral coercive measures by other means and part and parcel of these states' complicity in the ongoing genocide in Palestine. In conclusion, I'm just going to note these two things from the past 2 days. The Atlantic Council yesterday issued a report on their so-called global sanctions dashboard, claiming that greater sanctions and coercive measures were needed to stop the Palestinian resistance from accessing funds. At the same time that NBC News published a report claiming that they had to investigate the financial sources of support for the protests of thousands and indeed millions of people that have swept the United States to end the genocide in Gaza. And so what are our next steps? Join the movement against the genocide, build our legal, political, social, and mass movement for the liberation of Palestine, and openly in support of the Palestinian resistance. The fact is, October 7th didn't start this genocide, but October 7th is changing the world. And what we are seeing is that the imperialist powers have not been able to achieve their goals, and the Zionist regime has not been able to achieve its goals despite the massive bombing and assaults. And this is why we're seeing all kinds of mechanisms that are trying anything to stop the unquenchable tide of the growing strength and power of the resistance that is moving from resistance to a revolution that is capable of freeing Palestine from Zionism and freeing the region from imperialism. And we also need to build the movement to scrap these so-called terrorists and delist Palestinian, Lebanese, and Yemeni resistance organizations, delist the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, delist all of these organizations that are being listed as so-called terrorist organizations, because this mechanism is part and parcel of the same illegal colonial imperialist sanctions regime that is targeting every nation around the world that seeks an independent road to development and freedom from imperialism and domination. This is a necessary battle. It's part and parcel of ending the siege on Gaza and on all of Palestine, and it means standing with and alongside the Palestinian resistance on the front lines of struggle. Thank you to everybody, and I apologize. I believe I may have gone over a little bit, but I'll just conclude with these two posters from Ghassan Kanafani that showed Gaza at the center of resistance over 50 years ago, and that's where it is today as well.
Thank you so much, Charlotte, for analyzing the horrific effects of Israel's siege and sanctions on the people of Gaza and placing it in the historical context of more than 75 years of occupation and genocide, and also for explaining how the siege is an effort at regime change and the power of the Palestinian resistance to Israeli occupation. So thank you so much for that. We will now turn to a brief discussion between the faculty members commenting on each other's presentations. Let's keep that brief because we have a number of questions that registrants have asked. So do any of the faculty members want to respond to or comment on the comments made by your fellow faculty members. Okay, well, I think we can move right into the Q&A portion, and we have a number of questions. First of all is a more general question I'd like to turn to, and that is, how does imperialism help the U.S. economically, and is that the primary motivation for sanctions? Does anyone want to respond to that?
I think Prabhat should, if I may.
Well, this obviously it's a very big subject. It's an extremely big subject. I'll just give you one illustrative answer. You see, capitalism requires imperialism. The Industrial Revolution in Britain occurred in cotton textiles, but Britain grows no cotton. Then it's a moot point. How is it that actually the premier industry of the Industrial Revolution was actually based on raw material imported from outside? There are large numbers of commodities, and of course this includes oil and so on, which capitalism is not in a position to produce to the extent that it requires. Therefore, it obtains these from outside. There are large numbers of agricultural commodities, fibers, and so on, which capitalism, the capitalist lands, which are essentially located in the temperate regions of the world, cannot produce. And therefore, they require the access to the production of these, and they also require that the land mass of the tropical regions, mainly the global south, is something that should be made available relatively freely for them to access. Now, suppose you actually have food self-sufficiency drives in the global south. In that case, the land is not freed up to produce things for the imperialist countries. Therefore, they want to break all these arrangements and to make the third world, the global south's economy adjust to their own, and that is imperialism.
Thank you, Prabhat. Do any of you know of efforts by the sanctioned countries to go to international tribunals and challenge these unilateral coercive measures, such as in the International Court of Justice, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, or the Inter-American Court of Human Rights? There was a challenge by Venezuela in the ICC some time back. Anybody?
Iran filed a suit in the ICJ, and they received a very favorable verdict this past summer. And then there are lawsuits ongoing, but those are not in international tribunals involving Iran, sanctions on Iran as well. I'll post I'll post some information about the Iran lawsuit in the chat box.
Okay, is the genocide in Israel a proxy genocide by the United States? In other words, a provision of arms, money, coordinating bombings, supporting displacement, injury, destruction of hospitals, withdrawal of aid to UNRWA. Is that apparent support by the U.S. for Israel's so-called right to self-defense? And I say so-called because, as Charlotte mentioned, under international law, and the International Court of Justice has actually said this, that an occupying power does not have the right to self-defense against the people it occupies in the occupied territory. So is this really a proxy genocide by the US in support of Israel's genocide?
I could speak a little bit to this, but I think that Nina also had some really good points in the chat earlier about this as well. I think there are many arguments for this. Essentially, right now, Nicaragua is actually taking Germany to court, to the ICJ. The hearings in that case will be on April 8th and 9th. And the reason why Nicaragua is taking Germany is for aiding and abetting genocide in Gaza right now. And Germany, of course, has also, like the United States, 10x'd its arms exports to Israel since October 7th, 2023. It has also banned demonstrations in support of Palestine, banned activist organizations working for Palestine, including Samidoun, subjected Palestinians within the country to a mass kind of wave of threats of deportation, stripping of refugee status and stripping of residency. And so in addition to its kind of very obvious kind of foreign policy and weapon sales, it's also been aiding and abetting the genocide through its domestic policy as well. Now, I know this question was about the United States, and of course, the United States is the most outstanding example of this. It is the US that is providing $4 billion in weaponry in Israel every year and has the capacity at any moment to say that we want you to stop and we don't want to provide any more of these weapons. And the fact is that rather than do so, it has continued, the United States government has continued to lie to the American people and to the world about Israel's non-existent right to defend itself, and continued to persecute and criminalize Palestinian legitimate resistance to occupation. And of course, as we've seen, the United States has been central to the imposition and maintenance of the siege on Gaza for the past 17 years. Also, the United States has seen, if, for example, it's gone out of its way to bomb and started bombing coalition against Yemen for taking action for the Ansar Allah movement, the government of the majority of Yemen, the armed forces of Yemen, to start a whole, once again, a military campaign against Yemen for taking meaningful action in the Red Sea to stop the genocide. And so the United States is actively engaged in every way possible in order to be part of the genocide, whether it's a proxy genocide or a co-carried out genocide, I think both could be reasonable explanations. Like, on the one hand, the US is directing the situation, but it also views the Zionist project as like a partner in the region and a partner in carrying out its goal of imperial domination, rather than one that it fully directs. However, we've seen US military officials, despite we hearing these statements of conflicts between Biden and Netanyahu, we've seen US military officials over the past 5 months sitting in military planning rooms in Tel Aviv. So whether we consider the US the director of the genocide or the co-director of the genocide, the US is directly involved in it in all circumstances and all understandings, and has playing a primary role in directing what is taking place. And it sees the growing resistance in the region as a threat to its control and domination over the region moving forward. And it wants to do anything to be able to put that down, including imposing tens and tens of thousands of civilian deaths on the Palestinian people and the mass destruction of civilian infrastructure. The reality of what if there was anybody who was still unaware of what the United States stands for in the world, that has now been exposed in a very vicious and bloody way before the world. And one of the things that Nina had mentioned in the chat was about the case that's being pursued by the Center for Constitutional Rights under US domestic law and its ratification of the Genocide Convention, DCIP v. Biden, which is specifically seeking action in US courts to stop the US's ongoing role in this genocide.
Okay, thank you, Charlotte. Lucrecia, this is for you. It seems that the ability of a country to achieve food sovereignty is one of the best ways to resist sanctions and to protect its people's welfare. Is Venezuela having success with this?
Yeah, it's very important to say in the framework of the application of the Unilateral Coercive. Venezuela is a state prepared in a moment to talk of the topic of food sovereignty. But with time, we have been reorganized the topic about internal production and the financing of those who do the production. There's not something positive of the sanction, but it's something help the country to move these things work. So we have been able to develop some national agriculture, and we have rubric, things that were being imported before from other countries. Some other countries that are being blocked, we're being actually produced in the country, and we have a guarantee of having food freedom in Venezuela. So we have to highlight the need to have a national production, and the countries are being sanctioned, like Cuba. They need to strengthen the national production and strengthen the technical assistance to those who do agriculture and production. We have different convenience of technical assistance with Argentina, with Nicaragua, other countries to improve our agriculture, and that has been able to help us and allow Venezuela to be able to resist some of the coercive measures that have been imposed on us. And I also want to answer another question in coercive measure. Venezuela's actual reporter and the Tribunal Court, the International Court, for human rights violation, because we see all the objective and subjective elements of Article 7 of the international law that defines the elements of those crimes against humanity. We had to do with the systemic action that are deliberate and planned against a civil country, and with the intention to create a hardship to the country. That demand was put in forth by the government. It has not been accepted yet, but we still put it forth as a state and and also the organization and social movements in Venezuela have been also working on that, and they know the impact of those coercive measures in different day-to-day life of Venezuelan people in terms of access to health, food, and education.
Thank you for that. Is the tension between the Philippines and China, including Taiwan in the South China Sea, etc., a proxy strategy of the United States against China? Would somebody like to comment on that?
I can comment on that a little bit. So Blinken was just in the Philippines. I wonder if that's what prompted the question. I'll just say as an aside, over the last few months, anytime Blinken goes anywhere, the news following his visit is always very, very bad. Blinken was in Israel whenever the hospitals were bombed. The first few months, Blinken was just in Haiti. Now we're looking at a horrible situation unfolding in Haiti. In any case, so Duterte, the previous leader of the Philippines, who was a very brutal leader, had expressed he didn't seem to be committed to the U.S. He sort of was leaning toward maybe aligning with China. He had expressed that at least vocally. He didn't run for re-election, and then the Marcos family returned. The son of the previous dictator returned to power, and which is a horrible development. And initially, it was unclear which direction, sort of whether the Marcos, how they would relate to China, to the rise of China. It appears like the U.S. is trying to pressure them to align with the U.S. and they've historically been a colony of the U.S. I mean, it's unfortunate, and so that's possible. But I'll add that right now, things are really up in the air. A lot of the nations that have historically been quite opportunistic in their decisions about who to align with it's not clear where they're going to land. And I think Saudi Arabia is an interesting example. All of these nations that have recently joined BRICS that were very, very close allies of the US, they're just opportunists. And so while it appears that the Philippines might be in the American camp, or that the Biden administration will buy them in order to get them into the American camp, I think over the next 2 decades or so, the puzzle pieces are going to align in very different ways than what we're seeing now. But just to answer the question directly, there is a dispute in the South China Sea, right, about the waterways in the South China Sea, and that is a direct result of China. There's a dispute between the Philippines and China over the South China Sea, which is indeed a direct result of American intervention in that region and American efforts to destabilize Chinese power in Asia. And Taiwan, the effort to destabilize Taiwan is also completely meant and designed to undermine China. And the situation is pretty serious, actually, in Taiwan. Paramilitary forces are emerging, and Taiwanese people, regardless of sort of where they land politically, are very concerned about the likelihood of war. Yeah, which would be a proxy war.
Nina, we are running out of time, and I'd like to spend the remaining time giving people an opportunity, the faculty an opportunity to make some brief closing remarks. So we will start with Prabhat.
I just wanted to mention one point, adding to what Nina just said, that, Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan was an act of deliberate provocation. I think fundamentally we are now seeing a period in which imperialism is under attack, is under threat, but for that very reason, it's become far more aggressive. This is you just find it everywhere, that the degree of aggression, in fact, despite the Pope's appeal, for instance, that there should be a peaceful settlement of the Ukrainian conflict, that is being rejected everywhere. And, Macron is even talking about sending NATO troops. So the aggressiveness of imperialism, it's a kind of hubris that the aggressiveness of imperialism is something which is actually arising in a period in which imperialism feels threatened, encircled, and so on. Therefore, we're going to see very dangerous and difficult times.
Thank you so much. And Lucrecia, do you want to make just a very brief closing statement?
Yes, first to thank everyone. I think it's an important conversation. Thank you for your comments, and an agreement with my comrades that right now, with the natural resources of the imperialist powers are in crisis. The global South countries have been threatened strongly by imperialism, and I think it's very important the resistance of the peoples to form alternative ways to resist and be in solidarity. And it's important also that as we're seeing this this change of the international economics, that we continue forward with the dangers that we're seeing in United Nations that are not able to stop the genocide in Gaza. They cannot stop the genocides in other countries. there has to be a complete revision of the international system and human rights to see how today we can generate new ways of organization of people beyond what is currently in power.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much. Nina, just a couple of words from you to conclude, please.
I'll echo what Prabhat said, which is that I think we are entering into very dangerous times, as reflected by the genocide in Palestine, best reflected. But just to end on a more optimistic note, I also think there's immense promise in this moment. And I do think it's likely that we are witnessing the end of European control over the planet. And that's an end of a 500-year reign. And so if I'm correct, and I hope I am, it's amazing to be alive and actually witness this, which seemed unlikely just 15, 20 years ago.
Thank you, Nina. And finally, Charlotte, a few words from you to conclude, please.
Sure. I want to agree with everything that everyone else has said in conclusion as well. And to say that, one of our slogans and the things that we often say is that, this didn't start on October 7th when we're out demonstrating and speaking about the genocide. And it's true, it didn't start October 7th. It started 75 years ago, or perhaps 500 years ago is more accurate. But the fact is that October 7th did change the world. And what we have seen since in the past 6 months is the absolute rampage of an entire imperialist bloc that sees its domination of the region and of the world falling apart and is willing to carry out the most massive crimes in order to keep that domination in place. But I think what we've also seen is that it will be unable to do so. And so we are in a moment when another world is not only imaginable, is not only possible, but is in the process of being real. And what we see in the millions of people on the streets everywhere, including in the heart of the imperial core, is a recognition that we as peoples can be part of the resistance and can be part of the change instead of part of this ongoing process of exploitation. So let's continue to keep on organizing and keep on building politically as well as legally, so that we can contribute in a meaningful way to what the Palestinian, Venezuelan, Yemeni, Zimbabwean peoples of the world, the Cuban people, the peoples of the world are doing in order to liberate this globe from imperialism and colonialism.
Thank you, Charlotte, for ending on that hopeful note, that optimistic note. I want to remind people about the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement against the Israeli occupation, which is having a real effect on Israel. Israel considers it to be an existential threat. Go to bds.org. This concludes our program. Will the faculty members please stay for a couple of minutes after? And hopefully we will see you all on April 11th for our next program, Course 3A. Thank you so much for attending.